connection is action. And when you tell parents, hey, here are some ideas of things you can do, it's so helpful because in their minds, it's like, oh, I can do that, right? I can leave a note. I can put on their playlist. I can watch a TV series with them. It's action, but it leads to that deeper emotion that keeps us tethered together as parents and kids.
This is Conversation Balloons, a podcast of interviews with experts and friends about all things generational. I'm your host, Leah Farish. Talking to us today is Amie Anger. She and her husband Nick live in Southern California raising 6 kids. She is a family and child therapist who's been in private practice for 17 years. And after getting a master's in social work, she did 2 postgraduate fellowships in early childhood development and intervention through the Yale Child Study Center. We're honored to have you on, Amie.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Leah. I'm looking forward to this.
Well, back when I was in undergraduate at Duke, I had a developmental psychology professor that said, it's probably an old joke in your profession. I used to have 7 theories and no children. Now I have 7 children and no
That
theories.
is so true. I've heard so many iterations of that, and they all ring true, right? We all have the answers when we're watching other people parent, and then it becomes us, and we're like, oh, yeah, it's a little different.
What's something that you were quite sure of as a scholar, as a young academic that now is hasn't?
That I've had to get flexible on. Oh, boy. Well, I think bedtime as my kids have gotten older, for sure, right? When I was little and watching new parents, like including my own siblings, like navigate bedtime, I was like, okay, we're going to make sure that we're very scheduled and everything, which was my sanity because once upon a time we had 6 kids, 6 years and under, including 3 newborns when we had triplets. So we really had to rely on schedules, but I would be watching other families go through the phase and I'd be like, oh, you got to keep that routine there. And as my kids have gotten older, you hit those preteen, teen years, and then high school and homework and extracurriculars come into play. I am eating my own words all the time, going, I know that I've got friends with younger kids who aren't yet in that stage who are probably appalled at the lack of structure that seems to be around bedtime, but it is part of just what happens as your family grows.
I wondered, as I was raising older kids, should there be any kind of ritual? Should they at least come in and say good night? I'm going upstairs, or I don't know. I just didn't want it to feel like I was treating them like little kids, tucking them in bed.
Yeah, yeah, they don't need to be tucked in, but I do there needs to be some sort of kind of like closure to the day, right? I don't just wanna kind
Yeah,
of wonder, have they just disappeared? Are they in their bed reading? Are they awake? Are they asleep? I kind of like at least that amount of structure, and for us, it's computer Wi-Fi goes off for their school devices. So they
mhm.
let me know when they're done with homework because then that device gets shut off and phones get turned in for we've got 2 right now that have phones and phones get turned in. And so that's all part of the bedtime ritual. And yeah, I definitely don't want to lose that like good night, love you sort of part of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good level, I think, of engagement. Um, how old is your oldest now?
My oldest just turned 18. He is a senior in
Oh
high
my
school,
goodness.
and so we are hitting that, like, imminent launching that feels so bittersweet. So we are in
Well,
definitely a different stage of parenting and prepping for that next stage that, quite honestly, I am not ready for. I don't love change, and I really love having all my kids under one roof. So I'm
yeah.
I'm not totally looking forward to that, but I'm also excited to see what comes next for him.
Oh, yeah. That'll be wonderful. Well, in your own childhood, were there any experiences or ways that your parents parented that you've consciously brought into your practice? Were there formative experiences that led you into this field? What was your upbringing like?
My upbringing, I am the youngest. I have 3 older brothers. So I am the only girl. My own dad, he had a very, very unique and challenging childhood experience where his dad died of cancer by the time he was 10. And when he was 12, his mom pulled up to their house coming from the grocery store and collapsed over the steering wheel and dropped dead of a heart attack. So by the time my own dad was 12, he was an orphan. And it's not something he spoke about a lot, but it is something that in looking in the way I was parented and seeing the things that he did and he cared about, he really put a lot of attention into creating experiences and ways for us to be together and connecting, just the little things. And it's it's the sorts of things that I look back on now as I'm giving parents advice on parenting and sort of guiding them on how to smooth that road a little bit. Connection is always my top piece of advice. Like, if you are connected with your child, parenting will be easier and connecting in the little things, right? Connecting along the way, doing those little things that are just like, hey, I like being with you. I want to be around you. And I often think about the experience. I was very regularly a passenger in my dad's car going to the hardware store on Saturdays, but he would let me shift. It was a manual car. And he taught me how to stick shift while we were driving. Just those little things where it was like, I felt big and important. I felt like I was mature enough and responsible enough to do those things. And it was just great time that I look back on with my dad that I really treasure. And both of my parents did a really great job of creating the moments and the experiences and focusing on helping us connect and giving us the opportunities to connect.
Mm, that's good. Yes, I love your, emphasis on connection, and it's a useful word. It sounds like something that a parent can latch onto, whereas more emotive words maybe are a little bit more to grapple
Well,
with.
and the connection can lead to the emotion. It can foster, it can support that, right? But connection is an action word, especially with our kids. It's like connection is action. And when you tell parents, hey, here are some ideas of things you can do, it's so helpful because in their minds, it's like, "Oh, I can do that," right? I can leave a note. I can put on their playlist. I can watch a TV series with them. It's action, but it leads to that deeper emotion that keeps us tethered together as parents and kids.
Is it touching involved also, or is that something that differs with different children, whether they need the touch of their parents?
I think the level of touch will certainly vary. And of course, if we're talking about neurodivergent kids who, touch might actually feel very uncomfortable for them, we have to be sensitive to that. But physical touch is so, so important. And you do it at the comfort level of the parent and the child. But what we know about physical touch is that when we are physically connected, when we have those points of physical connection, it raises our oxytocin. And naturally, that's the connecting hormone, the love hormone, right? We naturally feel more connected. And when oxytocin goes up, cortisol goes down. So we feel more connected and less stressed. And there's no way that that's not a win for everybody. Physical connection
Mhm.
will look different for kids over the years and over the developmental lifespan, right? Like your teenager might not be as open to being as physically affectionate and they might not tolerate that when they're entering the teen years or going through puberty and feeling discomfort in their own body. But certainly there are other ways to continue doing that. I definitely feel like physical touch is very, very important.
Mhm. My sister was, in ballet and had very demanding, you know, physical work she had to do, and at night, her feet would hurt, and my father would rub her feet every night,
Oh,
and
I
I think
love
that was
it.
really special for them, you
Absolutely,
know?
right? It is connecting. So whatever it looks like, however it makes sense for you and your child, be intentional about it.
Mhm. I liked what you said on an Instagram recently, "This is how I found you." I love your wisdom that you're able to distill into manageable bites.
Thank you.
You said connection is so important, and reconnection is an important skill for the adult to have.
Yes.
Talk about that a little bit more.
Yes. So my sort of mantra is connection is your best parenting tool, but reconnecting is your second best parenting tool. Because we know in the land of parenting, there are so many opportunities a day to both have that connection and then feel that disconnect. And it might be that our child is feeling disconnected from us, but we don't realize they're feeling disconnected, right? It's a very
Yep.
nuanced sort of thing, but I would hate for parents to leave with this feeling of, well, I did something and my child's mad at me or we got in an argument, so I'm a failure as a parent. You are not a failure as a parent. Be intentional about connecting, but also we're realistic and we live in the real world. I am a real parent with real kids, and those things are going to happen where you're going to have those moments of fracture, conflict, disconnection. And modeling for our kids and giving them the experience of reconnecting, teaching them what does it look like to apologize. And we're talking teaching by doing. Um, I think about relationships on sort of this sine wave that it's just a very natural, the ups and downs. We're going to go through periods. Up here is where we're like, very well connected and this range here. But when we get down here, I believe that that is our sign of recalibrate, redirect, do something to kind of course correct because when you're down here, it is actually giving you the momentum to get back up here, but it's with intention. If we hang out down here and we're in conflict with our child and we aren't intentional about reconnecting, or we say, well, I'll apologize to them as soon as they whatever,
Mm.
we put ourselves in a position to be stuck down here. And when you're stuck down here, you lengthen that time and you set yourself up for more conflict by remaining in this like low grade state of disconnection. So I
Mhm.
really try and help parents understand that when you take that dip, when you have that fracture, get really good at reconnecting, do it quickly, don't make it conditional. Don't make it conditional on what your child does or doesn't do or how they behave. Take responsibility for your part, apologize, talk about what you wish you had done or said differently so you own your part, and then make an effort at reconnection so that you can get back up here faster. Whether it's kids, marriages, whatever we're talking about keeping this cycle, lengthening the time up here and decreasing the time down here.
Oh, I love that. It reminds me that, if you're conditional in relating to your child, it really puts them in charge of the relationship.
It does, and that's a scary place to be, and of course, your child has a voice in the relationship and has
Yeah.
their own control over how they engage in it, but when you as
Mhm.
the parent completely relegate that to them, that does it sets your relationship up to be very fragile, and what we're looking to develop as parents, we wanna develop very strong relationships with our children that help them develop a strong sense of self.
Yeah, and you're also modeling, uh, reconciliation. You're modeling, like you said, owning the part you had in the disconnection, um, and so you're not only working on this relationship, but how that child will eventually handle relationships that have had ruptures, um, later in their lives.
Absolutely.
That's really important.
Absolutely. There's nothing that makes me happier than when I see one of my kids, I like see something happen or we experience something together and they come to me and I hear some of my own language or my husband's language come back to us like, hey, my bad. I should not have done that. Like, I'm sorry. And this, like, let's move forward where we really are
Mhm.
teaching our children patterns for future relationships. And we want to teach them good boundaries, healthy relationships, and that mistakes are part of relationships. It's not about being perfect. It's not about being defensive if somebody says, hey, I don't think you meant this, but when you said that, it actually really felt like a dig or it felt like a criticism. Instead of coming from a place of, what I would never say that. Why would you even say that and being so defensive? Instead, just being able to model for our kids like, oh, wow, that makes me really sad that you thought that. I'm so glad you told me, and I'm really sorry that it came off that way. What I was trying to convey was this, right? We are setting ourselves up for a great relationship with our kid, and we are priming the pump for them to have great relationships in their life, which really what greater gift could you give your child than to set them up to really be in healthy adult relationships?
Mhm. You often say that parents well, I'm summarizing several things you've said. Let's see if this is an accurate
Okay.
summary. Um, Parents think they have, set boundaries for kids, but actually they
Oh,
haven't. Think they have a lot of boundaries in place,
yeah.
and then you observe, and where's that discrepancy?
Well, the discrepancy comes, for example, if I say that I have a boundary around curfew in our home, like, no, my kids have to be home on time, but my kids come home 15 minutes late, 30 minutes late after curfew. If I only say that that boundary is there, but there is no follow-up consequence that is connected to that boundary, I actually don't have a boundary. My kids know it because they're sensing it, because they're seeing like, "Oh, they don't really care," right? I don't really care. There are so many ways that this can come up in families, right? You have parents who say, "Oh, I would never allow my child to talk to me that way. We don't allow arguing. We don't allow back talk, disrespect, not doing homework," whatever it is, a boundary is only a boundary if it is supported by a consequence. And it's interesting because I've gotten not a lot, but some like scattered kickback on that of like, oh, but you're punishing, right? That's a punishment. And some people level that as though that's like the biggest criticism you could give. You're punishing your child,
That's the deal
right?
breaker.
Like, oh, that I would be like, oh, please don't ever think I would punish a child. No, sometimes consequences will be uncomfortable, but I am an absolute proponent of finding a consequence that is connected to whatever the behavior was. And sometimes that will just naturally show itself. And other times, as parents, we have to sort of like help it fit and connect the dots for our child. And
Mhm.
it is okay if that consequence feels uncomfortable to our child. I think sometimes we are getting so caught up in keeping our children comfortable all the time that we're forgetting that growth comes from discomfort. Lessons are learned from discomfort. So if I say that I have all these boundaries and yet my children are regularly crossing those boundaries and there's nothing that happens in response, then I actually don't have a boundary. I have a boundary in theory, but not in practice. And theoretical boundaries do not get the parenting job done. I'm sorry to say, they just do not actually yield any good results in families.
Why do you think parents are inconsistent about enforcing boundaries?
Oh, I think there's so many reasons that come up. The one that I see most often in my private practice is that children's reactions get so big and grow bigger and bigger that sometimes parents truly are just like, I am not sure that I'm willing to take the fallout from this. I'm just going to kind of like let this one go. I am not up for the fight. So sometimes it's that. I think sometimes it's just a lack of understanding what that boundary could look like and how they could further support it with a connected consequence. So I don't think there's any one size fits all reason that they don't, but I do think sometimes we are scared of our child's reaction and we ourselves emotionally are not willing to be like, I don't have the energy for that right now. I think sometimes
Mhm.
life just gets busy and things slip through the cracks. And I think sometimes we just simply aren't sure what that looks like. And we just haven't been trained, right? Parenting now is so different than what parenting was when I was growing up and when you were growing up. So we're all learning. And in a lot of ways, I'm like, I got more training on how to give my baby a bath when I left the hospital than I did about like how to deal with a toddler's tantrums or how to help a child go comfortably to school, right? I feel like one of the lucky ones
Absolutely.
because my training was all about all of these things. So I felt very comfortable with different ways. But I think in general, sorry about the puppy in the background.
That's a
In general, we have not equipped parents with a lot of really good sound strategies to use. We have large like theoretical ideas, but helping parents see, okay, here's the idea, here's what it looks like in practice, here's how it might look in your own home. We're filling that gap. And there's so much great information now that is helping to fill those gaps. So many tremendous resources for parents, but I think sometimes we don't know. We're doing the best that we know. Sometimes we're parenting from how we were parented, and sometimes we are rejecting how we are parented and trying to find a different way and maybe left floundering.
Mhm. Because you didn't have any other model. Yeah, I call millennials the "I've got this" generation because what I see is they are kind of crowdsourcing strategies, and they're learning off the internet, and, older older generations aren't being consulted as much. Uh, you know, I considered my mom and a couple of books, T. Berry
Mhm.
Brazelton and a few other authors were just that was it.
Yes.
Yeah, there's no internet to go to.
If it wasn't in those chapters, you didn't need to know it.
So, yeah, it is different and it's exciting to see. The young parents I know, they have a reason for everything they're
Mhm.
doing. They've thought about it. Um, but sometimes, as you've said, it's not durable, it's not right for every age and for every child, but they're they're finding their way in a different way than I
They
did.
have more information literally at their fingertips than any other generation of parents have had, right? So you can tease
Yeah.
out like there's not a one size fits all for every parenting situation, but there are so many voices out there that hopefully you find the one that resonates for you and that you say like, yeah, this really aligns with my belief system and my style and yeah, I'm going to take some of the key takeaways from this and what a gift.
I have noticed one thing, and I see it a little bit in what you're saying, but, I interviewed Julie King, who wrote How to Talk So Little Kids Will Listen, um, and asked her about this, but especially when it gets into the teen years, I wonder how parents can help give their kids a moral vocabulary. I see a lot of phrases like, big feelings or consequences, words that don't have any moral
Mm,
content. Saying, I notice I don't feel good when I tell a lie. That's a way to teach children not to lie. I don't feel good after I have been unkind to somebody. And that's really important and effective, I think.
I do too.
But I'm wondering where a child gets the moral content that affects their conscience, that forms that coheres with whatever the religious tradition is that the parent wants to pass on, if any.
Mhm.
Um, how do you start giving meaning to moral words if they're not part of relating in the home? Does that make
It does
sense?
make sense. It's such a fantastic question, and I'm, like, piecing together the different parts of it. So I hope that I can do the question justice in the way that I answer it. You started that out by mentioning in the teen years, like, how do we do it there? It's definitely not a switch that just turns on in the teen years. It's something that you have to have it's this scaffolding that you are doing that at age appropriate levels throughout the time that your child is growing up. I think the difference that comes in the teen years is that our teens can tolerate a bit more transparency and honesty from us as parents. So, sharing our own observations, sharing our own shortcomings, sharing the big mistakes that we made, and talking about how we regret that and how that affected, if we're talking, you mentioned a faith base or something like that, also bringing in a spiritual component of like, I feel like that affected my spiritual relationship, my spiritual growth. Um, but it is expanding beyond big feelings and whatever. But it's like, we are also moving away, thankfully, from using shame as a tool. And so not using the ways that we talk about our mistakes or our children's mistakes in a way that is like shame based or what would people think. Like thank heavens I feel like we're steering away from that and realizing it's really about developing integrity. It's about being the person who you say you're going to be no matter who is watching or not watching. And
Mhm.
there is also so much out there with social media, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat. there are examples all over the place of people using their voice for good and people making decisions that you as a parent might feel like, "Ooh, the path that this leads to concerns me." And you can use those sorts of things that don't feel super confrontational to your child, but feel like the springboard for a conversation to say, "Hey, I'm seeing this going around. It seems like social media, this is the latest trend. What are your thoughts about that?" And opening it up for a conversation where you, as the parent, can also share your own experience, the experience of people you love and care about, and just the values that you as a family hold, right? And talking about, well, in our family, or you'll figure this out for yourself, but I hope as you're figuring this out, you're thinking about X, Y, and Z, and sharing your values openly with them, sharing your values and mistakes openly and honestly with kids, because our teenagers can handle it, and it's great knowledge for them to have. It really resonates with them.
Mhm. Do you think it is shaming to name, uh is it shaming to name, uh, a misbehavior? Like, when you kick that puppy, uh, that's cruel, or it is selfish to cover up the damage you did at the neighbor's house and not admit that you did, or, is there a place for using morally weighted words rather than just calling them mistakes? Or is that the shaming that you're talking about that we have to avoid?
I think those words, labels like that, I think can become shaming. I don't think across the board, if you name it, it will, but I think it can. And I feel like if that's the level of conversation you're having, right? Say it's unkindness to an animal, right? You kicked that animal, like, how dare you? That's so cruel. I think what you do is you actually shortchange what the conversation could be, because shame doesn't actually teach. Shame doesn't actually lead to long-term change. Shame actually lives deep inside and then can sometimes devalue the person that leads them to then do other things. So I think that the mistake comes not necessarily because it can become shaming, but I do think it can, but because it really shortchanges what the experience can be, right? So instead of a reductionistic comment like that in response to a behavior, something like, "Oh wow, I was really surprised to see you do that. Like what made you do that?" And expanding on the conversation from there. Like, are you glad that that's what you did? Do you wish that you had handled that differently, And the talking about a puppy thing feels a little bit heavier than what we would give that, right? Like the examples don't totally match, but hopefully you get the point I'm getting at, that rather than just being, say you find out your child cheated on a test, just being like, "That was so dishonest of you. I'm so disappointed in you," could lead to shaming, where you could really open up that conversation instead to be like, "Wow, I was really shocked to get this email from the teacher. Talk to me. Tell me what was going on." And helping them walk through and helping understand, okay, how did we get to the point where that felt like the best decision to make? Because then we can use that to learn. But also going forward, how did you feel afterwards? Like even before you got caught, how did you feel? Because for me, there's no amount of money or no grade on a paper that is worth it for me to feel that way. I just have never felt proud of myself after I've done something like that, giving them that example from you, but finding out, how did you feel? And how do you want to
Mhm.
feel? And hey, next time, take the C minus. Like we would be way happier if you learned from that, of like, dang, I procrastinated. I shouldn't have done that. Take the C minus and use it to to make that mistake a better one, not to take one mistake of not planning ahead to study and then making a bigger mistake by deciding to cheat. Instead, take it, own it, get the bad grade, and then learn from it and move forward in a way that is improving rather than devaluing yourself.
That takes a little bit of
It
courage.
does. It really does. And I
Yes.
think that that's when kids benefit so much from parents, around the dinner table, something where parents share an experience of, "You will not believe what happened today. And I had to," like, I pulled into a parking spot, I scraped somebody's car. I felt horrible. Nobody was around, but I've left the note. The person texted, like I felt like such an idiot, but I left the note, right? Owning when we make the mistakes because it's easy for our kids to think, oh, the adults have it figured out. And little do they know we don't, right? We are still making mistakes. We're still doing or saying things that we regret and letting them hear how we owned it and and took responsibility and accountability.
Mhm. I just think that I felt important to convey to my kids that their moral choices weren't about how I felt about it, and they weren't even about how they felt about it. They were about how God felt about it, and it was not subjective, um, and that we don't decree what's right and wrong because I think a person that goes through life thinking that as long as I feel good about it, it was the right thing to do.
Mhm.
There's some external standard that I think that I wanted my kids to refer to that wasn't decreed by
Mhm.
me and wasn't what I was comfortable with. On the other hand, I like your concreteness about talking about in our family, this is how we do things. And I've heard other people say that one person that kind of objected to it, they had been exposed to kind of this family narcissism, like
Mhm.
it was all about family reputation and
Yeah,
you know
image.
things like that. It was kind of like you'll bring shame upon the family if you
Yeah,
do that.
yeah, speaking of
But
shame, right?
yeah, but, a relative I have is raising his kids to say, "In our family culture, we don't do
Oh,
this."
right?
I kind of like,
Yeah, you hear that coming out of a little kid's mouth and you're like, "Ooh, we're sounding very, very old and very developed over there," right?
yeah,
And
that's pretty
it's
sophisticated.
very sophisticated, but great for them, right? Because this is my biggest thing is every family does have to do what works for them. And even if the phrase is in our family culture or, you know, we choose not to or in our family, whatever it is, but helping children identify with like, hey, we do what works for us, you do what works for you, I think also sends a really strong message of not setting our kids up to be in this comparison culture and the comparison culture right now is so rich and so real for our kids that really helping set this emotional boundary around it by even tiny phrases like that, we're we're just like putting coins in the meter, for lack of a better phrase, but we are really kind of giving them these little moments of like, hey, this is what boundaries look like. I do what works for me. Our family does what works for us. It might be different than what works for you, whether it's phones or sleepovers or dating or whatever it is, that starts little. And and that goes a long way in helping your children realize, you know, maybe that time when they're out on their own and another child wants them to do or say something or they're supposed to go do or say something that child says like, "Oh, no, that doesn't work for me. I'm not going to do that, but you go ahead." Right? It
Mhm.
translates, and that's really what we want, and we're teaching our kids about boundaries through all of these little moments and experiences.
And that makes it incumbent upon the parents to be consistent with
It
that
sure does. Our
standard,
kids will
you
hold us
know,
accountable.
like,
They'll keep us honest. They will hold us
"Just don't
accountable.
lie."
Yeah.
Yeah, they hear you lying, then they go, "Okay, what is this
Oh,
family about?"
100%. Like, "Hey, we don't tell a lie except when we're at the movie theater and it gets us a cheaper ticket." It's like, "No, your kids are watching, and they will remember that." Right? Integrity is
Mhm.
integrity.
Yeah, I appreciated your addressing the issue of a child who, speaks horribly to his own family members in the home, whereas outside he's a different person and he speaks very appropriately. It reminded me of, when I was raising my kids, I had a firm rule that we just don't use the word
Mhm.
hate. Um, you can use it later when you have grown up and you've really thought about it, but, um, it's not a word that's that's useful. You may be angry, and I wanna hear how you're feeling, but, that's a sinful thing to do, to hate somebody. We don't do that. We don't use that word, and, they
Yeah,
didn't. And so it never came up that they'd have that moment where they'd say, "I hate you,"
mhm.
or "I hate," you know, um, and, they came out to be very loving, tolerant children, and, just that little guardrail was made it easier for me, to know that that was just
Yeah,
off
that's a line we
limits.
don't cross. And
Yeah,
I think our kids like
um,
that. I think our kids and that doesn't mean that they won't push it sometimes and they won't cross it, but really the safety and security of having, like, the knowns in your house, I my belief is just as much as good fences make good fences make good families. And these boundaries that we have around behavior, how we treat people, the way that we respect one another, even down to like dinner time etiquette that, like, hey, phones are not out at the table. Those sorts of boundaries set our families up to be better connected and to treat each other respectfully and for our homes and families to feel like a safe place and a place that ultimately our children choose to come back to. Because at a certain point, they leave the nest and you want them to choose part of this larger family culture.
such a good approach to parenting, Amy. I'm so glad you're out there sharing these ideas, and, tell people where they can find more about you and how to access these good
Oh, thanks so
insights.
much, Leah. So I'm most active on Instagram. You can find me at The Real Parent. I'm also on TikTok at the dot real parents. And you can also access available courses and find out more about working with me on my website at realparent.com.
Beautiful. Well, I hope everybody does that. Thanks to my producer, Caleb Broker, and, we appreciate your coming on today. Your time is valuable, and we learned from you.
Thank you
Thank you.
so much, Leah. And thank you to Caleb. This has been wonderful chatting with you.